Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video, and today we are going to be revisiting Simple History. Great YouTube site. Definitely check them out. I'll put links in the description to some of my other reactions to their content, as well as the link to the original content for this particular video. We're going to take a look at their video on the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier today. Now, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, in this case, they're obviously, as we can see from the image at the beginning, talking about the American Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, but there are dozens of countries who have tombs of the unknown soldier. Iraq has a Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. I know Hungary does. France, the United Kingdom has an unknown warrior, which is interred at Westminster Abbey. In fact, a lot of times you will see when they have royal weddings, for example, that they will go around. When they first walk into Westminster Abbey, you'll notice they don't walk straight through. They go around because they go around the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior, who is right at the entrance to Westminster Abbey. So a lot of countries have that. In fact, we'll take a look at the end at some of the other countries' unknowns and where they are. And there are multiple unknowns here in the United States as well. There's a Tomb of the Unknown Revolutionary War Soldier in Philadelphia. I believe there's a monument to the tombs of the unknown Civil War soldiers in Arlington, not real far from this one. And I believe there's a tomb to an unknown Confederate soldier as well. So let's go ahead and dive right into this one.
The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, the Silent Sentinels. The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is at the Arlington National Cemetery in Arlington County, Virginia, across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C., and was erected in 1921 as an eternal resting place for the unknown American soldier killed in France during the First World War. It was a monument to all those unknown American servicemen who died serving their country in the Great War. In the future, the United States of America were to become embroiled in other conflicts, such as World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. In these three wars, hundreds of thousands of American lives were lost. The identity of many of these fallen servicemen was never determined. They, too, were paid tribute by lying down bodies of unknown soldiers near their comrades from World War I.
So let's talk about Arlington for just a second, a little bit of the history there. So originally when the United States was formed, and the agreement they came up with to create a new capital city was actually part of what they call the dinner table bargain between Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson. They have this very famous dinner in New York City, which was the capital at the time. Alexander Hamilton's trying to get his debt assumption plan. He's the first Secretary of the Treasury, and a lot of people say he was really kind of a de facto prime minister for George Washington. Washington left a lot of the running of the government to Hamilton, and Hamilton's Treasury Department was by far the largest department in the early part of the country. So Hamilton's trying to get this debt assumption plan passed, and basically to sum it all up without getting too deep into financial stuff, he was trying to create credit for the United States. And even today, how do you get credit? Well, you get credit cards. You create the opportunity for debt, and you get yourself credit that you can build on. And so what they do is he wants to get the federal government to assume the debts of all of the states that they incurred during their Revolutionary War, which means now the states owe money to the federal government to pay off those debts. And now because the federal government has people who owe them money, they're more likely to be able to get money lent to them by other nations. And that's Hamilton's whole thought process. Well, the states' rights folks, people like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, they don't like this because that means more power for the federal government. So they've got to come up with a compromise. And so Hamilton gets kind of his faction, which becomes known as the Federalists, to support a plan to build the new capital city in the South, or at least further toward the South. And they come up with the site of Washington, D.C. And originally, it was supposed to be carved out half from Maryland and half from Virginia. And for a while, the District of Columbia was a perfect square. But eventually, over time, the part in Virginia was given back to Virginia. And that is now Arlington. Fast forward, I know I'm going pretty deep into all this, but fast forward a couple of generations, and Arlington is owned by Robert E. Lee and his wife. His wife, Mary, had inherited Arlington from her father, George Washington Parke Custis, who was the adopted son of George Washington. He was actually Martha Washington's biological grandson. And so now they own this mansion. And during the Civil War, the federal government, who controls the area, seizes Arlington and the property because Robert E. Lee failed to pay taxes, because, of course, he's fighting in a rebellion against the U.S. And Montgomery Meigs, who is the, I forget his title, but he's like the, let me look it up. That's what it was. Quartermaster General of the United States is looking for a site for a national cemetery to start burying Civil War dead, and so they choose to start burying them in Robert E. Lee's yard so he can't ever return to the country. Eventually, years after the Civil War, the federal government was sued, and it was actually ruled in favor of the Lee family that the government had no right to do that, and so the government reaches a settlement where they buy Arlington from the Lee family. But by that point, there are thousands of American soldiers buried there, including Montgomery Meigs' own son.
From then on, the tomb of the unknown soldier became a monument to the memory of all unknown servicemen who died fighting for the United States of America. More recently, they have built the Northwood Gratitude and Honor Memorial in Irvine, California, which remembers all of the fallen American heroes of the Afghanistan and Iraq conflicts since 2003. The idea of building a monument to the unknown fallen soldiers arose after the First World War. During the war, the United States had lost over 130,000 servicemen. A great number of those men were buried far from their homes in special mass cemeteries in France near the battlefields where they had lost their lives.
So let's talk about the losses in World War I for the United States. The U.S. basically is only in combat in World War I for about 6 months, maybe even less. We enter the war in April of 1917. We sent some advisors, including George S. Patton, who goes on the staff of General Pershing, to France. But it's really only in the early part of 1918 that significant numbers of combat troops start arriving. And it's really, I mean, there are a couple of places here and there, but it's really large portions of American troops really don't get into combat until you have the Marines fighting at places like Belleau Wood. So it's really only like the summer and fall of 1918 that the U.S. is really heavily involved in combat. And most of the U.S. combat deaths happened during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in October of 1918. This is the last war where the United States will lose more men to disease than they do to combat wounds.
The number of those whose identity was unknown was not inconsiderate. It was a similar situation with the other combatant countries. The French and British were the first to create tombs for the unknown soldiers in the memory of their fallen men.
So, like most wars, there are issues with identifying the bodies. And, a lot of men are simply wounded in such a way that they can't be identified. Most troops are not wearing dog tags yet. I mean, this is something that is developed in the 20th century, but a lot of guys, like in the American Civil War, would pin their name in the back of their shirt so they could be identified. But a lot of what happened in World War I was that men would get killed out in the middle of no man's land, and you just couldn't get to the bodies to be able to bury them. And so a lot of these guys just stayed there. And you go to a place like the Douaumont ossuary today in France, and you see these large numbers of bodies that are just mixed in. They just got hundreds of thousands of bones. You don't even know which side they fought for. There's German bones and French bones and British bones. They're all kind of mixed together, because they died out there and they decayed out there, and then eventually they ended up under the ground. And there's probably tens of thousands of bodies that have never even been found from World War I.
In France, the tomb was placed at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. The unknown British soldier was buried inside Westminster Abbey. Soon, the idea was adopted by other countries in Europe.
Yeah, and I think the British one is not called the Unknown Soldier, but the Unknown Warrior.
In the United States, Brigadier General William D. Connor, who commanded the American troops in France during the war, advocated a similar idea after hearing of the French project. He proposed the idea to the Chief of Staff, General Peyton C. March, on October 29, 1919. But he dismissed the idea as it was thought that the Army Graves Registration Service would eventually identify all of the American dead, so there wouldn't be a need for such a memorial. On December 21, 1920, the New York Congressman Hamilton Fish Jr. introduced a resolution calling for the body of an unidentified American soldier who was killed in France to be returned back to the United States and to be put into a tomb to be...
So this is a really cool story about how they do all this, and you can find pictures of some of this process online. And also, if you go to Arlington, they've got a great display that explains a lot of this process of how the unknown soldier was selected, how they were brought back. They've got pictures of the whole ceremony that they had for the unknown soldier.
Specially built at the Memorial Amphitheater in the Arlington National Cemetery. Congress approved this measure on March 4, 1921. Arlington was already known as the burial place of the unknown American soldiers. The cemetery was established during the American Civil War on land that belonged to the Confederate General Robert E. Lee. The Union Army used it to bury 16,000 of its soldiers. After the war in 1866, the bodies of 2,111 unidentified soldiers killed at the Battle of Bull Run were reburied in a mass grave marked by a stone monument.
I believe some of them are Confederate. They're not just Union, because there weren't 2,000 just on one side that were killed at the Battle of Bull Run. These also are not what Civil War uniforms would look like, but I'm not going to complain too much about that, I guess. And I think the unknown for the Civil War is a lot bigger than this. Like, it's up higher than this marker they show here.
Arlington was the perfect location for the new tomb. The question was, how would they select who should be buried inside of it? While waiting for congressional approval to build the tomb in March 1921, the United States already had 1,200 dead soldiers whose identities were still being processed. The Army wanted to make sure that there wasn't the slightest possibility of the chosen unknown soldier's body being identified at a later stage.
Which happened with the Vietnam
Eventually,
unknown.
in September 1921, 4 bodies were exhumed, one from each of the 4 American cemeteries in France. The bodies were inspected to confirm that the soldiers had died from combat wounds, and there were no records of their identification. After the inspection, they put the bodies in caskets and sent them to Chalon-sur-Marne. Over there, the honor of choosing the body for the tomb was given to Sergeant Edward S. Younger, a highly decorated infantryman still on active duty. The day before, American and French soldiers moved the caskets around to make sure no one knew from which cemetery each of them came from.
Here, in fact, let's take a look, because I think there's a picture of these 4 caskets. Okay, so I couldn't find that, but now I understand why they were showing the image they were. They were actually showing the original unknown soldier grave as it existed. Not, they were talking about the Civil War unknown, but that's not what they were actually showing. So this is the one that was selected right here. And this is them carrying it to a train so that they could bring it back to the U.S.
Sergeant Younger made his choice by placing a spray of roses on top of one of the caskets. The body of the unknown soldier was then placed in a sealed coffin and shipped to the States on board the USS Olympia. The other 3 bodies were buried in a cemetery near Paris. The unknown soldier's body arrived in Washington on November 9, 1921. It was displayed the following day in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, where in just one day, 90,000 citizens paid their respects to the unknown soldier. On November 11th...
Think about this. If your son was killed in France during the war, and they never identified his body, and so he's buried over there somewhere, there's a chance this is your son. Wouldn't you want to go and pay respects? Wouldn't you want to go and... probably most people knew someone who died in the war. 100,000 Americans, everybody knew somebody who died in the war. Or at least knew someone whose family lost someone. And so it makes sense that they would want to honor him. And, that's the importance of these unknowns, is that it's an opportunity to pay tribute to all of the unknown soldiers who were never identified.
11th, 1921, on the anniversary of Armistice Day, the body was taken in a funeral procession from the Capitol to the Arlington Cemetery, where a state funeral ceremony was held. A field artillery battery from the nearby Capitol Mall fired a salvo every minute during the procession. They paused only during the 2-minute period of silence at the beginning of the ceremony. Before it was laid in the tomb, President Warren G. Harding placed a Medal of Honor on the coffin. Admiral of the Fleet Lord Beatty also laid the Victoria Cross Medal on the coffin, on behalf of King George V and the British public. The original tomb from 1921 consisted of only a 3-level slab made of white marble. the tomb was projected to serve as a foundation for a bigger monument which was yet to be built. In 1926, Congress authorized the completion of the tomb by placing an appropriate monument on the existing foundation.
So let's talk about that ceremony for 1 minute, because one of the really interesting things about this are who some of the pallbearers were. And keep in mind that most of the time when you see funerals like this, or funeral for a famous person or a president, things like that, when you see pallbearers listed, they are typically honorary pallbearers. They don't actually physically carry the casket in most cases. Perfect example of that would be when Joseph Johnston, who was an elderly man by this point, is a pallbearer for General Sherman. He didn't carry the casket. He walked behind the casket, as did all the honorary pallbearers. So I'm not entirely sure if these were honorary or if they actually served as pallbearers, but two of the pallbearers for the unknown soldier, one of them was Alvin York. If you're not familiar with his story, I've got videos on it. One of the heroes for the Americans of World War I, highly decorated, receives the Medal of Honor for his actions at Hill 223 in October during that Meuse-Argonne offensive. And another one was Charles Whittlesey, who was the commander of the Lost Battalion. Another story we've talked about here on the channel that you should definitely look into. And unfortunately, Whittlesey would take his own life very soon after he served as a pallbearer for the unknown soldier.
A competition was held to design the structure and was won by sculptor Thomas Hudson Jones and architect Lorimer Rich, who were awarded the contract to build the monument. The neoclassical monument in the shape of a sarcophagus was made of the finest and whitest American marble, the Wohl marble. The monument was impressive, with a height of 11 feet or 3.3 meters. It was 8 feet or 2.4 meters wide and 13 feet 11 inches or 4.2 meters long at the base. The top had a width of 6 feet 8 inches or 2 meters and a length of 12 feet 7 inches or 3.8 meters. The weight of the entire tomb was an enormous 160,000 pounds or 80 tons. The north and south panels of the monument were decorated with 6 inverted wreaths separated with Doric pilasters. The initial idea was for the wreaths to represent the world of memories, but they later became the symbols of the 6 largest World War I battles in which the American forces fought. The east panel facing the city of Washington had a composition of 3 figures representing peace, victory, and valor, but also 3 allies from the war, the United States, France, and the United Kingdom. The opposite panel facing the amphitheater had an inscription carved upon it. Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known but to God. The monument was mounted on the existing tomb in December 1931, giving it the appearance that we see today. In the early days, there weren't any guards posted at the monument. It was only in 1925 that a unit was deployed to watch the monument during the day. In 1926, the monument was put under permanent 24-hour watch. There wasn't any particular unit assigned for the duty at the time.
4th U.S.
They all came
now?
from the Army, as the oldest branch of the armed forces. However, in 1946, the duty of guarding the tomb of the unknown soldier was permanently presented to the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment.
Okay.
Better known as the Old Guard, the 3rd Infantry was one of the oldest units of the U.S. Army and was responsible for performing all ceremonial duties in the capital and for protecting it in emergencies.
There are some really cool videos you can find online of kind of some of the behind the scenes of the 3rd U.S. Infantry and the detail to which these men and women, because there are women very often as well, that these men and women have to have their uniforms, exact. And they go through all of this really rigorous, it has to be perfect. And part of what they do when they do the changing of the guard is they're inspecting the uniform, inspecting everything to make sure that it's perfect. And they've got the steps down perfect with the 21 steps, and then they wait 21 seconds. And it's considered, perhaps the highest honor you can possibly have in the U.S. military to be one of the guards at the Tomb of the Unknown.
Guarding the tomb of the unknown soldier is, however, the most honorable of all their duties. At the same time, it's one of their most onerous duties, as it calls for nothing less than perfection.
Mm-hmm.
All members of the 3rd Infantry Regiment are eligible for the duty, which is carried out on a voluntary basis. In order to become a sentinel of the tomb, one must have an impeccable military record and pass rigorous tests and interviews. Those who meet the requirements are sent for intensive training with the goal of achieving perfection in every aspect of the Sentinel duty. The duty of a Sentinel is highly stressful, as it's exposed to constant review and inspection in order to maintain the set standard. For this reason, many Sentinels give up or are withdrawn from duty after only a few months. Those who remain in service for more than 9 months are entitled to wear the Sentinel Badge permanently, an insignia in the shape of the tomb with laurels around and an inscription Honor Guard. Apart from the badge, tomb sentinels are distinctive for the impeccable army dress blue uniforms and sunglasses they wear because of the bright reflection of the white marble. While on duty, sentinels protect the tomb by marching back and forth on a 63-foot or 19-meter rubber mat placed on a plateau west of the tomb. The path has to be crossed in exactly 21 steps, after which the sentinel makes a 21-second pause, turns around, makes another 21-second pause, and walks back in 21 steps. The symbolism of the number is connected to the 21-gun salute, the highest salute used in military ceremonies.
Highest salute used in military ceremonies in the U.S. I believe other nations use different numbers than 21. 21 just happens to be what we use.
All the time, the sentinel keeps his weapon on his shoulder closest to the visitors as a gesture of protecting the tomb from all threats. If a visitor violates the restricted area, the sentinel brings his rifle to the front as a warning sign. If the warning fails, only then will he shout out a warning. Apart from that, the entire duty is performed in complete silence, hence the nickname, the Silent Sentinels. Guards are relieved every half an hour. In the ceremony of changing guards, an officer of the guard inspects the guard's uniform and weapons.
I believe it's every half hour part of the year and every hour the rest of the year. It depends on the time of year.
During wintertime, guards change every hour, while on the night shifts, the change takes place every 2 hours. For 35 years, the tomb was a monument to the soldiers fallen in World War I only. In 1956, President Eisenhower signed a bill to honor the unknown soldiers killed in World War II and the Korean War in the same manner. True to the tradition, the internment ceremony that took place in 1958 was exactly the same one held in 1921. When choosing the remains of a World War II unknown soldier, one body was taken from the European theater of war and one from the Pacific. The Korean unknown soldier was chosen from among 4 bodies exhumed from the National Cemetery of the Pacific in Hawaii. Both unknown soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor before their bodies were interred in the crypts on the plateau west of the tomb on May 30th, 1958. The last unknown soldier to be interred at the site was one from the Vietnam War on May 28, 1984, Memorial Day. His body was laid in a new crypt placed between his comrades from World War II and Korea.
Now, when I was in 8th grade, I was part of my 8th grade trip to Washington, D.C., and they drew 4 names from our class of about 100 students to be a part of the wreath-laying ceremony at the Tomb of the Unknowns, where you get to walk down the steps and then walk out. 2 of the students would get to actually walk out with the wreath and lay the wreath at the Tomb of the Unknown. I got to be one of those 2 students who got to go out with the wreath. Kind of an interesting little tidbit. I saw somebody post the other day on Facebook, one of those things where it says, who's the most famous person from your high school? And I got to thinking about it, and now with 200 and some thousand subscribers, I thought, you know, it might be me. I went to a really small high school, and we don't really have anybody particularly famous. Maybe my cousin, his name was Easy Whitaker, who was an All-American in football in college, played for Pitt back in the 60s. Might be him. But if not, it's probably me. And if it's not me, then it's my classmate who was actually in Playboy, and she was the girl who helped me lay the wreath at the Tomb of the Unknown. If I find a picture before I edit this video, I'll throw it up there of us doing that, but I'm not sure I have one off the top of my head. But yeah, when I was there and did the wreath-laying ceremony, the Vietnam unknown was still there, but he's since been identified as Lieutenant Michael Blassie, who was a pilot who was shot down.
10 years later, however, independent research determined the probable identity of the soldier. A DNA test taken in 1998 positively identified the body as belonging to Lieutenant Michael J. Blassie. After his family expressed a wish to bury Blassie in his hometown, the body was exhumed and the crypt left empty. From then on, it represented the memory of all those American servicemen whose bodies were never found. Even though it has no official name, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is the most iconic monument at the Arlington National Cemetery, reminding the nation of all those who gave the ultimate sacrifice in serving their country.
So yeah, really cool experience. If you ever find yourself in Washington, D.C., definitely check out Arlington National Cemetery. And if you do, definitely go to the Tomb of the Unknowns. Watch the Changing of the Guard. It's a powerful experience. It's probably one of the most visited things in Washington. Happens every half hour. They do a whole ceremony. They'll play taps. It's pretty powerful and definitely worth your time. So here's the Wikipedia page that talks about some of the tombs of the unknown soldier, and you can see how many there are: Argentina, Armenia, Australia, Austria, Bangladesh, Belgium, and just down the list. And you can see exactly where they are and read more about them: Egypt, Finland, France, Gambia, Georgia, Germany, and all the way down. So I'll put a link in the description so you can read about some of those for yourselves. So let me know your thoughts. If you have anything to add to what we just talked about, use the comment section below. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.